welcome to July. We made it. Whew, holy smokes. June was an epic month and an epic year. All of those cosmic shifts, right around the summer solstice, or rather the solstice. And July is going to look like a piece of cake comparatively. So continuing on the moon theme for July, we are still in Cancer season. Cancer is ruled by the moon. I wanted to talk about how to use the phases of the moon in your business. In addition, we will be talking about the full moon eclipse that's coming up on July 4th or 5th, depending on where you're at. Before we dig into the moon phases, I wanted to read a review by a very special listener. Her name is Allison Mondell, and she gave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. And she says, amazing insights and practical advice. I have worked with Leslie, and I cannot overstate her gifts. Her unique recipe of branding and astrology is incredibly special, and she has a gift for crystallizing astro weather and concepts into both practical business advice and deep personal insights. She is a shining person, and her genuine, warm, personable nature make listening a pleasure. Her wisdom and clarity make her podcast content indispensable. Oh my goodness, Allison, thank you so much for the beautiful review. We'll be sending you a special Savvy Luminary gift, so check your mail. And if you've been listening to this podcast, your rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher helps the algorithm of this podcast so it gets heard by more people. Please considering rating and reviewing the Savvy Luminary to help a woman out. This time last year, I was in Taos, New Mexico, teaching some moon classes at a yoga retreat for feminists by the amazing Natalie Miller. I had such an amazing time. I've been to Taos a number of times. I have a really good friend that lives there, and it just speaks to me at a soul level. Well, I was there and I was teaching a couple of classes on our moon sign and how to use our moon sign. And there was one participant, I remember her. I can't remember her name, but I remember her face because she was so awesome. Because, I'm talking about using the moon to cultivate more alignment and flow and, really optimizing and scaling certain things by using the moon sign. And she's just like, nah, I am not into it. I don't believe in the moon signs at all. But I know that it works. And I was like, ooh, tell us more, right? So she was explaining that her and her husband, they are gardeners and they often grow vegetables during the summer. And so she was saying that they had got a bunch of bean seeds and a couple of bean starts, and she wanted to go ahead and plant them one day. And her husband was like, no, we need to wait a couple of days until this right moon phase. Like, he was very in tune with the Farmer's Almanac, and he was going to follow it. And I don't recall her mentioning which moon phase it was, but he was going to wait a couple of days before he planted his seeds and his beans. And this woman, she just had no patience. She's like, I don't have time to wait for a couple of days. I need to do it now. I want to do it now. So she went ahead and she planted her beans, exact same beans, right next to the little plot where her husband was going to grow the same beans. Well, she said, not even 2 weeks later, the results were clear. Her beans never really got a really good start, even though she planted them 2 days before, and her husband's beans had already exceeded by like a foot or more than her beans that she planted 2 days earlier. So she said, while I don't really believe in astrology and moon phases, she knows that planting by the moon does work. And so when we think about planting by the moon, you might have heard me talk about this before. Why wouldn't that apply to our businesses? So while we may not be planting tangible things like plants and herbs and things like that, we are definitely planting other things. We are planting ideas, we are planting projects, we are planting experiences. You've heard me talk about my work with nature spirits before. I learned about nature spirits from a book called Paralandra, right? And in the Paralandra books, there's a company called Paralandra LLC or LTD, I can't remember, but they have a number of products that allow you and teach you to work with nature spirits. Nature spirits, they want to co-evolve with us. They essentially see anything that a human designs, like any purpose or intention or desire that a human has, they see it as a garden. So in our business, even our business, our projects within our business, our relationships that we want to kind of intend and mold and design, they call these soilless gardens. And I think that is so beautiful, especially when we decide to use one of the easiest cosmic cycles that we can visually see from our place here on Earth, the moon phases. Nature already knows how to grow with the moon. In fact, all life on Earth has co-evolved with this consistent pattern of the moon. Everything from tides to seasons to growing and planting and harvesting, all aligned with the moon. Today, we are going to be looking at the 8 major phases of the moon. There are practitioners, witches and other Wiccans who use 16 phases of the moon. And oh my goodness, the native ancient Hawaiians took the cake and actually have 29 phases of the moon, one for each day, and broken up into 3 big sections. I'll post a link on the show notes at thesavvyluminary.com, and you can take a look at some of these Hawaiian moon calendars. More on that in just a little bit. Now, a lot of people ask me questions about when should I launch something? When should I start something? Everybody has questions around astrology with cosmic timing and cosmic cycles. Now, to teach somebody cosmic cycles, there's a lot of things at play. Of course, there are your natal energies, right? I can't just give a blanket statement to somebody and know that it's going to work for everybody. For example, we've been talking about Mercury retrogrades, where by the time you listen to this, by the time this episode drops, we will still be in Mercury retrograde. And oh my gosh, as we've been taught to not, start anything new during a retrograde, Mercury retrograde, not, sign things. And in the last episode about Mercury retrogrades, I talked about understanding the energy of the Mercury retrograde so you can use the energy to sign things, to do things, because the life doesn't stop, right? Like we can't just stop. So for example, I was talking to a client today. We were having an astro brand reading, and she wanted to know when to start her group. And she was concerned because we are in a Mercury retrograde. But when we looked at her natal chart, guess what? She was born during a natal Mercury retrograde. In fact, she was born at the midpoint of Mercury retrograde. So it was super powerful for her to use that energy because it was really aligned with her. So when you're beginning using cosmic cycles and timing in your business, let's start simply and let's start using the moon phases. The moon phases are really easy to grasp. Any 2-year-old will tell you the moon phase. I remember my son was so enamored with the moon when he was a baby. He would point at it and he would say, moon, moon. And he would know when the moon was full and he would know when it was a crescent. He would always be talking about the phases of the moon. And I wasn't teaching him that. He was just picking it up on his own. So if we begin with using the 8 phases of the moon, we can then begin to harness the moon energy and work within the flow of Mother Nature. The phases and concepts that I'm going to go through with you are going to work with everybody. Of course, there are customizations. If you know your natal moon phase, if you know your moon progressions and your moon sign, there are always going to be ways to customize each of these phases to work best for you. But that is all too much for this one episode. So let's get into the 8 major phases of the moon and working with it in your business, essentially a soilless garden. So before we get into the 8 major moon phases, why do you want to work with the moon phases in your business? Well, earlier I mentioned, yes, you want to get into the natural rhythm of Mother Earth. Why not work with the natural rhythm as portrayed by the moon? The tides do it. Other creatures on the earth do it as well. It allows you to go with the flow. And when we understand the different moon phases, we can see that there are times for activation as well as rest. So we can get into the balance of working and resting, working and resting. Rest is so lost in our current culture. And to expand on what I mentioned earlier with our first step in working with cosmic timing, the cycle that we know the most intimately, of course, are the moon phases. So the moon phases are a regular dance between the sun and the moon, our 2 closest luminaries as perceived from us here on the earth. For the 8 major moon phases, let's start off with the first phase, the new moon. The new moon is when the sun and the moon are at the same degree. From our perspective on Earth, if you can actually see the moon, it will just appear as a dark disk because it is in between us and the sun. This is the starting phase because at the darkness of the moon, it is a time to intend. If we're going with our gardening theme, this is when you would plant your seeds of intention. When you plant a seed and think about the intentions, you have an idea of the harvest that you would like, right? For example, if you were going to plant a tomato plant. But when you're intending something, when you're planting the seeds, you're not micromanaging the plant. You're letting the nature spirits, you're letting the soil, you're letting the light, you're letting the water do their magic to help their plant grow. So you might plant 5 seeds to be able to take home 10 or 20 pounds of tomatoes. I'm guessing there, I don't actually plant tomatoes, but you're not saying, okay, seeds, now you're going to root on this day. Now you're going to sprout on this day, right? When at the new moon, what you're doing with your intention is having the big idea. What is the end result? Putting that end result, packaging it up into a little seed and planting that seed into the earth with a new moon ritual. That is one of the reasons why I love doing new moon rituals, because I love planting seeds of intention. I've even named my entire business New Moon Creative LLC from this phase of the moon because I find it to be so powerful. After the sun and the moon are exact in the sky, which is the new moon phase, about 72 hours later, we have the waxing crescent phase. Waxing is a term for growing light. And crescent is the little sliver, the little smile of a moon that you see in the sky. So waxing crescent is the growing light crescent. And if we go to our gardening theme, the key word here is to sprout. Again, if you're actually gardening, you're not micromanaging these plants to sprout. There's no action that you really need to do besides watering it and fertilizing it and making sure that it has the space to sprout. So in our businesses, this is the time to plan. When you're planning, you want to write down all of the different tasks that need to get done. And then yes, here, because we live in a physical world and we are growing our soilless gardens, we then assign timelines and due dates to each of these tasks to ensure that they get done in the right order and the right time. But again, if you get really stuck in the planning phase, if you're using nature spirits, you can always ask them for guidance so that they can provide you with the strategies on the best plan of action. About a week after the new moon phase, we have our first quarter phase. Some astrologers like to call this the second quarter. I look at this as the first quarter. The first quarter moon in the sky looks like the disk of the moon is half dark and half light. If you're into astrological aspects, this would be the forming of a square, a 45-degree angle between the moon and the sun. If you know your squares are full of energy. Square aspects usually have some kind of trigger from the outside that enable us to take action. So when we look at our moon phases and at the first quarter, this is time to act. This is the time where you put your foot to the ground and take forward action. Looking at our planting analogy, this is when our sprout would then send its roots deeper into the ground. So this would be the time to root. This is such an important time for our business because during the first quarter moon period, which each of these phases lasts about 72 hours. And it's during this time where we can really accomplish a lot of those tasks, these new tasks that will enable our business to grow, that will enable your project to root. Next comes the waxing gibbous phase. Remember, waxing, it means increasing light. And gibbous is more than a half moon, but it's not quite a full moon, but it's definitely getting that round look that we associate with the moon. And this is a time to not necessarily keep pushing forward, but it is a time to be patient. With our planting analogy, we call this the gestate phase. This is a developmental period, the space and the time that a plant or a fetus needs to grow in the womb. For your projects or your business, this is a really great time to notice what needs growing. Yes, we have to take action. We have taken action, but this is almost like a little bit of a resting period where we get to see and notice how the project itself is growing. Instead of trying to micromanage every single movement, maybe the project will expand or evolve in a way that is surprising, a pleasant surprise, something unexpected that you're truly happy with. Our next phase is the full moon. We are so familiar with the full moon. The full moon happens about 2 weeks after the new moon. And if you've been following me for a while, you know that I like to do release ceremonies, forgiveness ceremonies during a full moon. When we think about the planting analogy, we would assign the keyword to blossom. Thinking about the act of blossoming, right now it's the middle of summer. There's a lot of blackberries in blossom. Right now there's a lot of apple trees in blossom. The cherries and the plums, they're already fruited and everything. They're not yet ready to harvest, at least where I'm living. But during the full moon, there is this blossoming. Now, if you've ever gardened, and this part I actually have done this myself. We used to have an apple tree, and right when everything was blossoming, we would trim some of the external branches and make the plant much more compact. And this process, called pruning, during this full moon blossoming season allowed us to produce more fruit during the upcoming harvesting season. So when you think about it, the full moon is almost like a completion of a cycle. It's when the moon and the sun are opposite of each other. That's why the moon, because it doesn't create its own source of light, is being illuminated by the light of the sun, the bright light of the sun. And so when we, in our business, when I mentioned to release and let go and forgive, basically what you're doing is you're pruning all of these things that no longer serve you so that your blossoms can become more vibrant, that your blossoms can bloom more truly so that you have a bigger harvest later. So if you're following me and you need any full moon rituals or release ceremonies, I have those worksheets for you. I often have a full moon ceremony in my free group, The Savvy Luminary, same name as this podcast, on Facebook. So you're welcome to come join us. Now, this is the second half. So up to here, we were talking about waxing moons, waxing crescent, waxing gibbous. The first quarter is waxing. It's gaining light to this full moon brightness. This whole time, if we can like divvy up the moon phases, this whole time the moon is growing in light. And if you think about your business, you want to do all of the tasks that enable things to grow, enable things to root, enable things to sprout. So these are things that, you're doing new things, you're launching new businesses, you're making new plans for things, new. Now, after the full moon, the light starts to diminish or wane, W-A-N-E. And so if you can think about the next phases as the light is waning, we are going to change gears with the projects that we want to do. Let me tell you in detail. So about 72 hours after the full moon, we have a disseminating moon. Sometimes this is called a waning gibbous. So waning, again, the light is decreasing, and gibbous, it's almost fully round. So it's, bigger than a quarter moon or a half moon. It's almost round. That gibbous is the roundness. And so this disseminating time is a beautiful time. It's actually one of my favorite phases of the moon. During a disseminating moon or a waning gibbous, it's time to receive. Oh, I think this is so beautiful. The key word with our gardening analogy is harvest. When you think about harvest on a community level, harvest is not just about receiving, but it's also sharing, right? In Hawaii growing up, the mango trees, when they would, when all of the fruit would get ripe, the mango tree would just be like dripping with all of these mangoes. And like, there's no way your family could eat all of the mangoes from this tree. So we would pick the mangoes, we'd share them with our families, share them with our friends and our friends and neighbors. And in turn, our neighbors would share things with us as well. So this waning gibbous, this disseminating moon phase right after the full moon is this beautiful time of receiving. And you can see just the action of sharing and receiving. It's not so overt. It's kind of like this more of a yin kind of phase that we are in. So a time to rest and enjoy the harvest. About a week after the full moon, we have the third quarter phase. And this is when the moon looks like a disc that is split in half, black and white. But this time the light is shining on the other side. I'll have some graphics up on the Savvy Luminary so you can see. And this is an amazing time as well. This is a more active time, but instead of building something, you are breaking something apart. This is the time to reevaluate. In our gardening analogy, the key word is decompose. So in your business, when you're breaking things apart, this would be kind of like analyzing data, assessing things to be sure that things are growing the way you want them to be growing, looking at your metrics, looking at your finances, and also looking at what you can repurpose. right? Because we sometimes, well, I'm speaking about myself actually, I get caught up on creating, creating instead of repurposing and refining. So the third quarter moon is really a great time to repurpose some of your great content that's doing well. Like I was talking to another client in my Luminary Rising program. She has an amazing podcast. Lindsay was asking some questions about her list, her email list, and what's the optimal number of emails to have in a sequence, and just talking about the challenges of writing all this content. And I asked her, well, what about your podcasts? What podcasts? She had mentioned that some of her podcasts were binge worthy, that once people listen to particular podcasts, they would go off and like listen to more podcasts. I was like, that's a key for you. Maybe you can repurpose that podcast and get it into your sequence so that you can drive more traffic to that one podcast so that they tend to listen more. So that would be one idea of repurposing content, finding your high performing content and reusing it in different ways in your email list, putting it in different places on your blog post, or maybe creating a medium.com article, lots of different ways to repurpose. And our planting keyword for third quarter is to decompose. And so this brings us to our last of the 8 major phases. And this is called the balsamic moon, also known as the waning crescent. Waning, again, the light is diminishing, and crescent, it's that little sliver of a smile. I think I mentioned earlier that I was talking to one of my friends about, using her balsamic moon. She was born during our balsamic moon, and I was talking about balsamic, and she's like, vinegar? But I do believe that the term balsamic vinegar actually got its name because balsamic vinegar used to be thought of as this healing elixir. So during a balsamic moon, it is the time to restore. It's the time to relax and nourish and fertilize and fill your cup, right? In business, this just means take a day off. Like, yeah, I give you permission, take a day off because you need to refill your energy. You have to nourish yourself. Get a massage. Well, we can't get massages anymore, but oh my God, I wish I could get a massage. That's like my ultimate self-care treat, is getting a massage. Like that's my absolute favorite thing. Meditate, relax, do some yin yoga. I love doing yin yoga, so you'll hear me talk about it a lot. But the key word with our planting analogy is compost. Right? When you compost, you take all of the plant material and you turn it into fertilizer so that you can start the cycle again. I have a beautiful graphic put together of the cycle of the phases of the moon that have the planting analogy and the time to do X, Y, or Z. You can grab this PDF as well as new moon intention worksheets and full moon release worksheets on my Patreon account at patreon.com/The Savvy Luminary. I have to say I'm quite enamored with this graphic. It's quite beautiful. All right, so in my free Facebook group, The Savvy Luminary, and if you're not already a member, hop on over and come join us. I asked for some questions about working with the moon phases. So let's go ahead and quickly answer some of these questions. The first question, actually a lot of questions come from Monique Lindner. She has some really awesome questions that Lindsay also says, yes, she wants those, everything Monique says. So her first question is, what rituals are best to do for each phase in general for the best outcome? For sure. So I think by just going through each of those 8 phases earlier in the podcast, I gave you some ideas of the tasks to do. Now, rituals in general, I love making everything a ritual. I mean, even when I come onto this podcast, I open a ritual, I open a ceremony. Every morning when I start work, I open a ritual, I open a ceremony. So I like rituals because it creates space for something to happen. And so when we think about the 2 vital rituals for every month, of course, the new moon intention ritual. I do these new moon circles in in my flagship membership program, Luminary Rising, where each month we look at the themes of that particular new moon. And because these are like my, this is my flagship, I know everybody's astrology, so we put also personal astrology onto it. And we do these intention settings for our business. And what's beautiful is that because there's basically 12 new moons, well, we have 2 in Cancer this year, because it cycles through all of the zodiac signs, we get to set new intentions for each part of our business and our life using the signs of the zodiac. So definitely do your new moon intentions and definitely do your full moon release and forgiveness ceremonies. It's so important, again, to make space by releasing things that are no longer serving you, mostly emotional like, emotional baggage that holds us back, right? And then that just makes space your harvest to be ever more so plentiful. Monique also asks, when is the best time to cut hair for hair growth and strengthening? Serious question though. For sure. So I am not a medical astrologer. There are astrologers out there who really specialize in these kinds of questions. If I can just give you, and I'm a business astrologer, so I want to specialize in business, but people's hair is really important for their identity. I know I try to keep my hair nice and shiny, and I love the silver streaks through it. So best time to cut hair for growth and strengthening is the phase during the waxing of the light, right? Because when we talk about the 8 phases, I was talking about as the light increases, we are doing things to grow and root and sprout. Now, there's other things to consider that I don't have enough information on. That includes like the different sign that the moon is in, and also, for your particular astrology. I'll have to find you another astrologer to answer those specific questions for you. Then you also ask, are there any do's or don'ts for business in each phase? Again, my answer is not a clear yes or no, because it really depends on your own natal astrology. Forgive me, but I can't remember what phase of the moon that you're in. So, looking at your natal phase does affect what phases are just kind of naturally you're drawn to. For example, I was mentioning that I love the balsamic phase, the waning crescent phase right before a new moon. And I was like, I was curious, why do I love that phase so much? Well, I'm born during that phase. So there are no hard do's and don'ts, just like when we're talking about the Mercury retrograde, but just understand what, if you can remember 2 things, the growing of the light for implementing new things, and the waning of the light for kind of recycling and analyzing things and taking things away. And then Nikki Stevens asks, how can we align the tasks we need to do in our business to the moon phases so that we can be super effective working in the flow? Oh goodness. Well, Nikki, I hope that my entire episode answered your question. Because yes, I do believe that our businesses and our projects are soilless gardens. And when we work with the light of the moon, with the energy of the moon, just like how Mother Nature works with the energy of the moon, we can get into the flow. We can get into the working flow and be super effective. Now, of course, if you're working for yourself, you can create these structures to work with the moon or to work with the moon flows. But sometimes if you work for somebody else and you have other things that are coming against you and, certain deadlines to meet, these arbitrary deadlines that other people set, those can be so difficult. But maybe you can still understand each of the phases and see how you can, for example, if you're releasing a new project and you're supposed to be building things, but the light of the moon is waning, it might be a really good time to do some analysis work, to check out some metrics to see if you can gather more data that will inform your next decision. So I know that Michelle and Janine, they both had similar questions, but I do hope that this entire episode served you with answering those questions deeply. If you're interested in healing your money stories and healing the way that you think about your superpowers in your brand and the way that you show up in your brand, consider joining my flagship program, Luminary Rising, for 1 month, the month of July. In July, we're going to be focusing on all things moon. In the last episode about how our moon sign affects our brand, I gave you 5 different keys as to how the moon affects your business. We're going to be diving into each of those keys in our business. And if you're interested in joining us, I'm looking for 5 to 10 more people to join us for this deep dive in July in Luminary Rising. During the month of July in the membership, we're going to have 3 special live ceremonies. We're going to be having a moon sign reading where I will be doing group readings for each person. And we're going to be having a new moon intention. And then we're going to be having a Q&A. Those are going to be the live sessions. Then we also have all of these trainings and an accountability group that's going to help you really dissect your moon sign, understand what motivates you, work through all of the fears that hold you back, and get to your why so you can really show up more confidently and aligned in your business. If you're interested in joining, head over to thesavvyluminary.com/rising and join us for the month of July. Normally, I only invite people for a quarterly or annual investment, but because I feel that the moon sign is so important, you can join for just the month of July for only $299 US. If you're interested, head over to thesavvyluminary.com/rising. Well, that's all I have for you this week. Welcome to July, and we can take a little bit of breath to do some integrative work. Until next week. Mahalo for listening to this brand new podcast. If you enjoyed learning about astrology for entrepreneurs, help me spread the word by sharing this podcast with your business besties, and hop over to The Savvy Luminary for links to episode notes and our free Facebook community where you can send me questions about astrology or branding, as well as connect with other like-minded businesses.